But right now, I will just introduce the next speaker, which will be Jan-Dirk Wegner. He's actually the group leader of the EcoVision group from the ETH and associated professor from ETHZ, University of Zurich. And he deals with time series as well, but also with extraction information in the field of forestry based on machine learning algorithms, and with, for me, incredible good results I never expecting. And I worked a lot with satellite data, but he get data out of it, which is just, yeah, astonishing. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and the nice introduction, Raik, and very happy to see so many familiar faces here. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will talk about machine learning for forest structure assessments, not so much about time series analysis, although we do a lot of work on that topic as well, but it would simply be a bit out of scope here. So what is our goal? So our goal is that ultimately we want a dense, near real-time forest structure assessment at global scale with 10 to 20 meter ground sampling distance. And we want to monitor vegetation parameters to have accurate, up-to-date input for climate and biodiversity modeling. And from the application side, for example, that goes into sustainable supply chain management and so on. And the idea here is to use single satellite images for all those predictions, so not any stereo multi-view stuff. And then to predict, in this particular case, what I will show you now, the vegetation height. But we are also working on, at the moment, on directly predicting biomass and other structure variables like the Gini index or RH20 and so on and so on. So this will be a bit more technical, this talk, and of course, feel free to ask questions later on during the virtual apéro. So one thing is, since we rely on freely available data from Sentinel-2, so optical multispectral satellite imagery in this case, which comes the highest possible ground sampling distance is 10 by 10 meters here. We do not directly apply any of these standard computer vision architectures, but we tailor them to this medium resolution satellite imagery to not lose any further spatial resolution. So we avoid any down or up sampling in our architecture. Stride is one, and we don't do any max pooling, for example. We then have 18 identical blocks of the separable convolutions. So this is from the CVPR Cholet paper 2017, where we have separate convolutions in the spectral and in the spatial domain, which saves memory and parameters, and also seems to nicely adapt to different patterns in texture and in the spectral signatures. So input is Sentinel-2 images with 13 bands. Then we increase the input feature dimensions quite substantially from 13 to over 700. And the output finally is canopy height map where color encodes height. So everything light, orange, bright orange is very high, and everything dark or violet is low. So, and the loss function here, to explain it just for those who are not used to this loss function, is rather simple. And to demystify it a bit, I wrote also to each of the variables what it actually means. So it's a standard Euclidean loss function for regression, because canopy height or vegetation height is a regression task. It's a continuous value that we want to estimate. And what we have here is basically this Euclidean loss plus an L2 penalty term. So in order to make sure to not overfit to our training data too much and have exploding values and parameters, we try to keep the squared of the parameters low, which is called weight decay in deep learning lingo. And everything that it really does is it's rather simple. So X is the pixel intensities here. So of those 13 spectral values per point on the ground. And then what it does, we compare to the ground truth during training, which is y at that particular pixel. And we want to minimize the difference between this function f of xy compared to the ground truth. So, and this function f is basically then the prediction of the height values. And that's all. So rather simple. And what we then do is we tested for 2 different countries. So Switzerland, that's where we all are based and where we have a lot of reference data. We got this one from WSL, vegetation height, and we evaluated on 2 different test regions here in this blue boxes. And another test region is where we got data from our NASA colleagues from the ELVIS program, where they, in the country of Gabon in West Africa, where they had 5 different sampling sites where they were flying a full waveform LiDAR aerial campaigns. And now we evaluate on those, and we predict them for the whole countries. So all the numbers that I show after cross-validation on those test regions, but we do forward passes and predictions then for the whole countries densely at the 10-meter ground sampling distance. And this is how it looks for Switzerland. So color again encodes height. So for Switzerland, we predict vegetation height between 0 and 40 meters. So everything very bright, and orangey again is high trees up to 40 meters, everything darker and violetish is low. And we get the mean absolute error, so which is a good measure to more or less get the accuracy for this regression task of plus minus 1.7 meters, which is of course poor compared to, let's say, aerial campaigns when you fly LiDAR or stereo vision. But if you consider that these predictions are made from a monocular depth estimation, so they're estimated based on individual Sentinel-2 images, they are rather good. And for Gabon, now this is a much harder sample, and also this country was selected because you have very dense forests and very high trees, so up to 60 meters, what we estimate here. And here we again estimate for the whole country, and we see this cutout here in the yellow box. This is interesting because this is a delta with a lot of mangrove forests, and they have super high mangroves here, up to 60 meters high. And we manage, despite them standing mostly in the water, to correctly predict them. And here the mean absolute error for the whole range of heights is plus minus 4.3 meters. So a bit better than 10%. So now, as you all know, we always need training data for deep net machine learning in general. If we want to go global, we need to have reference data beyond Switzerland, Gabon. And this is where the NASA JEDI mission comes to the rescue. So the goal and what we want to do is really have a global vegetation height map, biomass, further variables in for users in the commodity sourcing domain, high carbon stock maps that tell them where they can expand, where they can expand their agricultural plantations or crop fields and so on, and where they should rather not. And we want to have then near real-time updates for these maps. We collaborate with the NASA JEDI team and some friends at the Amazon Research Lab in Tübingen, spin-off from the Max Planck Institute there. And the idea is really that we basically calibrate the JEDI footprints, the LiDAR footprints, and then we take those as reference data to train the approach that I showed you before, such that we get an almost global coverage for biomass, vegetation height, and further parameters then. So this is how the JEDI mission is set up. So this is the International Space Station. And you can see here now, this is the JEDI sensor, so a full waveform LiDAR sensor attached to this payload module. And it's looking down on Earth, sending 8 beams. And you see there's gaps here between those beams, rather 4.2 kilometers watt width. So there's several hundred meters gap between the individual tracks, and then of course also between the individual footprints. And this is how such a signal looks like. So there's one pulse going out and it samples over 1,000 returns, which then nicely captures the vertical structure of the forest. So you see the intensities here. So you get a lot of signal back the top of the canopy. Then when you move down towards the ground, you get less and less, and then you can get the ground peak. And to calibrate the vegetation height for this Jedi full waveform LiDAR, we have to basically estimate the difference between the first peak and the second. And we do this using the calibration sites from our NASA Jedi colleagues. So our partners are there, Ralph Dubai and John Armstrong, who were very helpful in contributing data and a lot of discussions. And this is how those data calibration sites are distributed. A lot of them in Northern America, of course, and various in Africa. So Gabon is here. Then in Europe, some in Australia, some Indonesia and Malaysia, some. And that's basically it. And the way this is done is that, so they have full waveform LiDAR data for all of those sites that we see here. And then they simulate for those sites this Jedi pulses. And then they correlate and co-register the real Jedi full waveform to the simulated ones. And this is then where they get the ground truth on the ground and match that. So and for the calibration, what we do is a Bayesian deep learning approach. You might know that the deep learning, generally, they have this one-hot encoding, and they are not probabilistic models per se. So you have to think about some trickery, how to better calibrate the scores to really get better calibrated uncertainties. And one way to do this is to run an ensemble of CNNs. So we have this 1D CNNs that calibrate the Jedi pulses. And so we have 10 times the same model. And we randomly initialize them, and all of them basically have a Gaussian negative log likelihood loss function, which is shown down here. And we always aim at estimating basically the mean value and the variance here. So we basically always, we do not only estimate one single value, vegetation height, but the whole distribution under the assumption that this is Gaussian distributed. So we have these two outputs per model, which then allow us to approximate the conditional distribution, the posterior for the vegetation height. And to make this a bit more transparent, so what we do is basically for each model, you get this distribution and the mean and the variance here. And then for each point on the ground, you get 10 different distributions. Here we show 3 different ones. So you get this ensemble here, and then we average across this ensemble under the assumption that if we look over all of them, that again is Gaussian distributed. And this is from the Kendall-Gull paper from computer vision inspired. So you estimate 2 different parts of uncertainty, epistemic and aleatoric. And I don't want to go into too much detail here. It's not necessary at this point, but the idea is that you basically assume that you have again a Gaussian across this ensemble, and then you estimate the variance of this Gaussian to get the final uncertainty for a particular height at a particular point on the ground. And if you do that, you get, so we do that, we train that and validate it and cross-validate and then predict for the whole range of the Jedi sensor. So you see that Jedi sensor, of course, only flies up so far north as the ISS is flying. So up here to southern Canada and northern Germany, roughly. So Siberia is not in it, unfortunately. And here again, canopy height is color encoded. So everything yellow is up to 35 meters and higher. Everything blue is closer to 0. And here, so globally, if we cross-validate it with our calibration sites, we get RMSE now here of 2.7 meters. If we take the 70% footprints that are most certain. So this Bayesian approach, so this well-calibrated uncertainty value is very helpful, not only for later post-processing, but also to filter the values and get rid of the outliers. So the 30% most uncertain footprints, we just filter them out. And we can wait for another pass of the Jedi sensor to, at that point, to get better values. So your next steps is now, what we are now currently working on is taking exactly those calibrated footprints and combining them with our Sentinel-2 monocular depth model to basically at global scale have vegetation height and maps, and then further down the road, further values. So that brings me to the end of my talk. So all of this work, of course, I do a lot of presentation and talking and so on, but the real work is done by my team. And this work is done by Nico Lang. So this is his PhD work that I just showed you. And of course, then there's a lot of other interesting ideas that you can think about. So if you want to go further north to the polar regions or Siberia, in terms of climate change, is a super important topic. We are now considering adding ISAT2 data, calibrating those as well. Of course, the synthetic aperture radar is very important. So we are combining this already now in another project for forest structure variables. And then in general, for all this LiDAR space-bound stuff, and beyond that, geometric deep learning is an interesting thing. So you basically no longer stay with a fixed grid of pixels, but if you look at those LiDAR footprints that we calibrated in one dimension, we could also look at basically context, which are then graphs. And this is another idea that we are currently following. So thank you so much for listening, and then happy to answer questions during the apéro.
Thanks a lot for the insights and the nice presentation. As you can see, thanks to clever used machine learning algorithms and deep understanding of the data, and of course, available training data, which is quite important also for machine learning, you can get also global scale products in a really high resolution. So just imagine having a global product with 20 by 20 meter, which means more or less you can see